The battle you can't escape. Spirit discipline versus flesh desire. There is a battle you did not choose, yet you wake up inside it every single day. It does not announce itself with noise or violence. It does not always come with dramatic temptation or obvious sin. Often it whispers. Sometimes it feels like tiredness. Other times it disguises itself as comfort, logic, pleasure, or even self-care. But beneath every disguise lies the same conflict, the tension between spirit discipline and flesh desire. This battle is not external. It is not primarily against people, systems, or circumstances. Those are only the stage. The real war is internal. It is the silent friction between who you are called to become and what your flesh prefers to remain. Between growth and ease. Between obedience and indulgence. Between eternal alignment and temporary satisfaction. Many people misunderstand the nature of this struggle. They assume the flesh is neutral, that desire is harmless, that discipline is extreme, or that spiritual growth should feel natural and effortless. This misunderstanding is one of the greatest deceptions of the inner life. The flesh is not neutral. Desire is not passive, and discipline is not optional. The flesh actively resists spiritual authority because discipline threatens its throne. The spirit seeks order, clarity, surrender, and alignment with truth. The flesh seeks control, gratification, familiarity, and comfort. The spirit calls you upward, the flesh pulls you sideways. The spirit builds slowly and deeply. The flesh demands instantly and loudly. The spirit thinks in terms of purpose and eternity. The flesh thinks in terms of relief and now. This is why you cannot escape this battle. You can ignore it, you can numb it, you can suppress it, you can rename it, but you cannot avoid it. Every choice you make places weight on one side of the scale. Every habit feeds one voice and starves the other. Every delay strengthens either discipline or desire. This is not a message of condemnation. It is a message of clarity. The goal is not to shame the flesh, nor to glorify struggle, nor to pretend that desire disappears. The goal is to understand the battlefield so you stop fighting blindly. Victory in this war does not come from intensity alone. It comes from awareness, consistency, and alignment. In this series, we will explore the anatomy of this conflict in depth, not in slogans, not in shallow encouragement, but in truth that confronts, stabilizes, and transforms. We will examine why the flesh resists discipline so aggressively, how spiritual authority is built internally, and why most people remain trapped in cycles they claim to hate but secretly protect. We begin where every real victory begins, with understanding. The flesh is not neutral. Why desire actively resists discipline. The first and most dangerous lie people believe about the inner battle is that the flesh is neutral. Many assume that desire is simply a natural impulse that can coexist peacefully with spiritual growth as long as it is not too extreme. This belief quietly sabotages discipline before it even begins. The flesh is not a passive force waiting for direction. It is an active system with preferences, habits, and survival instincts. When discipline appears, the flesh does not negotiate. It resists. The flesh is built around preservation of comfort, identity, and familiarity. It does not ask whether a desire aligns with purpose. It asks whether it feels good, familiar, or relieving. This is not because the flesh is evil in a dramatic sense, but because it is reactive. It operates on sensation, memory, and immediate feedback. Discipline, on the other hand, operates on delayed reward, unseen growth, and internal authority. These two systems do not share the same language. When discipline enters the picture, it threatens the flesh's control. Discipline introduces boundaries. Boundaries expose patterns. Patterns reveal dependencies. And dependencies reveal how much power desire has been quietly holding. This is why the flesh reacts so strongly, not just to strict discipline, but even to small, consistent changes. The moment you decide to wake earlier, pray regularly, fast from distraction, or say no to impulses that once ruled you, resistance appears almost immediately. This resistance often disguises itself as reason. The flesh rarely says, "I don't want discipline." Instead, it says, "You can start tomorrow," or "This isn't necessary," or "You're being too hard on yourself," or "Balance is more important than restriction." These statements sound wise on the surface, but they serve one function: delay. And delay is the flesh's greatest weapon. The flesh understands something the mind often ignores. Discipline compounds. A single act of obedience does not threaten its dominance. Consistency does. That is why the flesh tolerates inspiration but fears routine. It allows motivation because motivation fades. It fears habits because habits rewire authority. Discipline is not dangerous because it is intense. It is dangerous because it is stable. Another reason the flesh resists discipline is exposure. Discipline forces you to sit with discomfort long enough to hear what your inner noise has been hiding. When distractions are removed, unresolved emotions surface. When indulgence is limited, underlying hunger is revealed. When constant stimulation stops, the mind confronts silence. The flesh prefers noise, because noise prevents confrontation. Discipline introduces stillness, and stillness exposes truth. This is why many people abandon discipline, not because it is physically difficult, but because it is emotionally revealing. They discover anxiety they did not know how to name. They encounter boredom they never learned to endure. They feel grief, restlessness, or fear that had been masked by constant activity. The flesh interprets this exposure as danger, even though it is actually the beginning of healing. Desire also resists discipline because discipline shifts identity. The flesh is attached not only to behaviors, but to the version of you that those behaviors support. When you remove certain habits, you are not just changing actions, you are dismantling an identity built around them. The flesh fears the unknown self that emerges on the other side of discipline. Familiar dysfunction feels safer than unfamiliar alignment. This is why self-sabotage often appears just as progress begins. A person commits to prayer, clarity, or self-control, and suddenly old temptations intensify. This is not coincidence, it is resistance. The flesh senses a loss of control and attempts to reassert dominance through urgency and craving. If you are unaware of this pattern, you interpret the surge of desire as proof of weakness. In reality, it is proof that discipline is working. The flesh also resists discipline because discipline introduces hierarchy. Discipline says that not every desire deserves a vote, and not every impulse deserves obedience. It establishes the spirit as leader rather than servant. The flesh prefers equality, where every urge negotiates. Discipline creates authority, where some impulses are simply denied without discussion. This is deeply uncomfortable at first. Many people confuse this discomfort with repression or imbalance. But there is a difference between repression and authority. Repression hides desire and pretends it does not exist. Authority acknowledges desire but refuses to let it rule. The flesh fears authority because authority limits its voice. Another subtle way the flesh resists discipline is through spiritualization without transformation. It encourages learning without practice, reflection without obedience, and belief without embodiment. The flesh does not mind spirituality as long as it remains theoretical. It resists the moment spirituality becomes embodied discipline that affects sleep, appetite, speech, boundaries, and daily choices. This is why many people know the language of discipline but lack its power. They can explain principles but cannot sustain habits. They can quote truths but cannot live them under pressure. Knowledge alone does not threaten the flesh. Application does. Discipline is truth in motion, and motion disrupts comfort. Understanding that the flesh is not neutral changes everything. It removes confusion. It explains why good intentions collapse without structure. It clarifies why you feel resistance even when pursuing what you claim to want. And it reframes discomfort not as failure, but as feedback. When resistance appears, it is not proof that discipline is wrong. It is proof that discipline is challenging something real. The goal is not to eliminate desire, but to dethrone it. Desire can exist without command. Impulse can speak without ruling. The flesh does not need to be destroyed, it needs to be governed. This is the foundation of spiritual discipline. Until you accept that the flesh actively resists alignment, you will keep negotiating with forces that only understand authority. Discipline is not cruelty. It is clarity. It is not punishment. It is positioning. And the moment you stop treating desire as neutral, you stop being surprised by the battle. You stop internalizing resistance as personal failure. You stop quitting at the first sign of discomfort. You begin to see the struggle for what it is, evidence that transformation is underway. If this message is helping you understand the inner battle more clearly and you want to continue this journey of spiritual discipline and clarity, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. Stay connected, because the next topics will go even deeper into how the spirit gains authority, how discipline reshapes identity, and how this battle ultimately determines the direction of your life. Discipline builds authority. Why the spirit must be trained, not merely inspired. The greatest misunderstanding about spiritual strength is the belief that it comes from inspiration alone. Many people assume that if the spirit is sincere, if the desire to grow is genuine, or if the intention is pure, then transformation will naturally follow. This belief sounds comforting, but it collapses under pressure. Inspiration without discipline produces emotional highs, not spiritual authority. And emotional highs cannot govern the flesh when desire becomes intense, persistent, or cunning. Authority is not a feeling. Authority is a structure built through repeated obedience under resistance. The spirit does not automatically lead simply because it exists. Like a muscle, it must be trained. Like a skill, it must be practiced. Like leadership, it must be exercised consistently to become effective. Without discipline, the spirit remains sincere but weak, knowledgeable but uncommanding, willing but easily overridden by desire. The flesh understands power dynamics instinctively. It does not submit to good intentions. It submits to consistency. When discipline is absent, the flesh senses the lack of structure and fills the vacuum. This is why many people feel spiritually motivated yet live flesh-led lives. The spirit speaks, but it has not been trained to command. Desire listens politely and then proceeds anyway. Discipline is the language of authority. It translates values into behavior and belief into structure. Without discipline, the spirit speaks in concepts. With discipline, the spirit speaks in commands. This distinction explains why people can agree with truth, yet repeatedly disobey it. Agreement does not equal authority. Discipline establishes hierarchy within the self. The spirit is not strengthened by dramatic moments alone. It is strengthened by ordinary obedience repeated quietly. The flesh does not fear occasional sacrifice. It fears daily order. A single act of restraint is impressive but temporary. A pattern of restraint rewires the inner command system. Discipline builds memory, and memory builds identity. Over time, the spirit stops asking permission and starts issuing direction. This process is slow, and that slowness is intentional. If authority came quickly, it would be superficial. True authority must survive boredom, fatigue, disappointment, and delay. It must remain steady when emotions fluctuate. Discipline trains the spirit to lead even when motivation disappears. This is critical because desire is most aggressive when inspiration fades. Many people confuse discipline with severity. They imagine rigid rules, joyless restriction, or harsh self-control. This misunderstanding causes them to reject discipline prematurely. True discipline is not brutality. It is precision. It is not about punishing the flesh, but about training the spirit to respond consistently regardless of emotional weather. Consider how habits form. Habits are not created by desire. They are created by repetition. The flesh forms habits easily because it repeats what feels good. The spirit must form habits intentionally because what strengthens it often feels uncomfortable at first. Prayer, silence, fasting, restraint, reflection, order, and obedience do not always produce immediate pleasure, but they produce stability, and stability produces authority. The spirit grows stronger not when life is calm, but when discipline is maintained under pressure. When circumstances become chaotic, the untrained spirit collapses into reaction. The trained spirit remains grounded. This is not because it feels better, but because it has practiced obedience in less dramatic moments. Discipline builds reflexes. Under stress, you do not rise to your ideals, you fall to your training. This explains why many people regress spiritually during hardship. Their faith was built on inspiration rather than discipline. When conditions change, their emotional support collapses and the flesh rushes in to manage fear, comfort, and control. Discipline would have given the spirit a framework to respond rather than react. Training the spirit requires intentional limits. Limits are not punishment, they are scaffolding. Without limits, energy scatters. With limits, power concentrates. This is why disciplines often involve saying no. No to excess, no to distraction, no to impulse, no to delay. Each refusal strengthens the spirit's authority muscle. Each boundary teaches the flesh that it is no longer the final decision maker. The flesh resists this training because discipline exposes its lack of control. When the spirit begins to lead consistently, the flesh experiences loss. This loss feels like deprivation, but it is actually reordering. The flesh has been accustomed to immediate response. Discipline introduces pause. That pause is where authority is born. Pausing before responding is one of the most powerful forms of discipline. It interrupts automatic behavior and reintroduces choice. The flesh thrives on immediacy. The spirit thrives on awareness. Discipline lengthens the space between impulse and action until the spirit can speak clearly. Over time, this space becomes natural. The flesh stops expecting instant gratification because it has learned that its voice is no longer sovereign. Another essential aspect of discipline is predictability. The flesh becomes anxious when patterns change. When discipline introduces regularity, the flesh initially protests, but over time, predictability reduces internal chaos. The flesh learns what to expect. The spirit gains stability. This stability becomes authority because it removes negotiation. When obedience is predictable, desire stops arguing as much. Many people fail at discipline because they try to rely on willpower alone. Willpower is fragile. It fluctuates with energy, mood, and stress. Discipline does not depend on willpower. It builds systems that function even when willpower is low. Fixed times, clear rules, consistent practices, and predetermined boundaries remove decision fatigue. The fewer decisions you negotiate daily, the less power the flesh has to bargain. Training the spirit also requires patience. Authority does not announce itself loudly. It emerges quietly. There will be long periods where discipline feels dry, unrewarding, or even pointless. These periods are not failure. They are training grounds. The flesh wants results. The spirit learns endurance. Endurance is essential because desire often intensifies when it senses you are close to stability. This is why many people quit just before authority consolidates. The flesh launches one final wave of discomfort, boredom, or doubt, and the unprepared spirit interprets it as a sign to stop. In reality, it is resistance to impending loss of control. Discipline must persist beyond the point where motivation fades. That persistence marks the transition from effort to identity. As discipline continues, something subtle but profound occurs. The spirit stops needing constant affirmation. Obedience becomes quieter, the internal noise reduces, decisions become simpler, the flesh still speaks, but it no longer dominates the conversation. Authority has shifted. This shift does not mean desire disappears. It means desire is contextualized. It is no longer the primary compass. The spirit does not suppress desire, it organizes it. Pleasure is no longer chased blindly. Comfort is no longer worshipped. The spirit decides what serves growth and what undermines it. This is why discipline is not restrictive in the long term. It is liberating. When the flesh rules, life becomes reactive and exhausting. When the spirit rules, life becomes intentional and grounded. Discipline creates freedom not by removing desire, but by removing chaos. Authority built through discipline also produces discernment. The trained spirit recognizes subtle temptations that once went unnoticed. It senses when something harmless is becoming habitual, when rest is turning into avoidance, when pleasure is turning into dependency. This awareness allows early intervention. The flesh loses the element of surprise. Over time, the inner battle changes character. It becomes less dramatic and more decisive. The spirit no longer argues extensively, it acts. Desire still appears, but it carries less urgency. Discipline has taught the flesh that resistance is futile in the long run. The spirit's authority is no longer questioned. This is the goal of discipline. Not perfection, but leadership. The spirit does not need to eliminate every impulse. It needs to lead consistently. Authority is not proven by absence of struggle, but by response to it. Discipline ensures that when struggle appears, the spirit knows how to respond. If you find that your spiritual life feels sincere but powerless, reflective but inconsistent, inspired but unstable, the issue is not your intention. It is your training. The spirit is willing, but it has not been disciplined enough to command. This is not condemnation, it is an invitation. Discipline is not reserved for the strong. It creates strength. It is not evidence of spiritual superiority. It is evidence of commitment. Every act of discipline, no matter how small, reinforces the spirit's leadership. Every moment of consistency weakens the flesh's claim to control. The battle you cannot escape is not won through intensity, guilt, or suppression. It is won through patient, consistent discipline that trains the spirit to lead without negotiation. Authority is not taken by force. It is built by obedience repeated until it becomes identity. If you want to continue understanding how spiritual authority is formed, how discipline reshapes identity, and how this inner war determines your direction, subscribe to the channel now. The next topics will reveal how discipline transforms the self from the inside out and why most people retreat just before real victory begins. Desire thrives on delay. How the flesh uses time to regain control. One of the most underestimated weapons of the flesh is delay. Desire rarely demands immediate rebellion in obvious ways. Instead, it negotiates time. It whispers, later, soon, now after this, or once things calm down. This strategy is subtle, patient, and devastatingly effective. The flesh understands that it does not need to defeat discipline outright. It only needs to postpone it long enough for momentum to die. Delay feels harmless because it presents itself as reasonableness. It frames itself as balance, wisdom, or self-compassion. But delay is not neutral. Delay is directional. Every time discipline is postponed, desire is reinforced. Every time obedience is delayed, authority weakens. The flesh does not need permission to rule forever. It only needs the spirit to hesitate consistently. This is why so many people remain stuck in cycles they consciously reject. They do not say no to discipline. They say, not yet. And not yet becomes a lifestyle. The flesh is satisfied with intention as long as intention never becomes action. It tolerates conviction without follow-through, because conviction without structure changes nothing. Delay works because it dissolves urgency. Discipline requires a sense of now. Desire prefers indefinite timelines. When action is postponed, the emotional intensity that fueled intention fades. What once felt necessary begins to feel optional. The flesh counts on this emotional decay. It knows that motivation is temporary, but habits are permanent. By delaying discipline, the flesh ensures habits remain unchanged. Another reason delay is so powerful is that it avoids confrontation. Immediate obedience forces a direct clash between spirit and flesh. Delay allows the flesh to avoid that clash entirely. No resistance is triggered because no decision is finalized. This creates the illusion of peace, but it is false peace. It is avoidance disguised as patience. The flesh also uses delay to fragment discipline. Instead of rejecting transformation outright, it breaks it into abstract future goals. One day I'll be more consistent. Eventually I'll change this habit. At some point I'll get serious. These statements sound hopeful, but they carry no authority because they lack specificity. Discipline requires clarity. Desire thrives in vagueness. Time is not neutral in the inner battle. Time either consolidates authority or erodes it. When discipline is delayed, the flesh uses the extra time to deepen patterns, strengthen cravings, and normalize dysfunction. What feels manageable today becomes entrenched tomorrow. Delay allows desire to become familiar, and familiarity breeds acceptance. This is why early intervention is critical. The longer a pattern exists, the more it embeds itself into identity. What begins as a behavior becomes a habit. What becomes a habit becomes a preference. What becomes a preference becomes self-definition. Discipline delayed at the behavioral level eventually requires confrontation at the identity level, which is far more painful. The flesh understands identity better than most people realize. It resists discipline, not only because discipline is uncomfortable, but because discipline threatens how you see yourself. Delay protects identity by preserving continuity. As long as change is postponed, the current self remains intact. Discipline, by contrast, initiates transition. Transition feels like loss before it feels like gain. Delay also creates psychological distance. When obedience is scheduled for the future, it feels less real. The flesh exploits this distance to minimize the importance of discipline. What is distant feels abstract. What is abstract feels optional. The spirit loses leverage because authority requires immediacy. This is why decisive moments matter. Not dramatic decisions, but small, immediate ones. The flesh fears moments where delay is removed and choice becomes unavoidable. Discipline compresses time. It brings the future into the present. Desire tries to stretch time, so consequences feel distant and obedience feels unnecessary. The longer discipline is delayed, the more internal negotiation increases. The mind begins to rationalize exceptions. Just this once. I deserve a break. This isn't that serious. These rationalizations do not appear randomly. They are the flesh adapting to delay. Without immediate structure, desire gains confidence and creativity. Delay also weakens trust in the self. When you repeatedly promise change and postpone action, your inner authority erodes. The spirit's voice becomes less credible. The flesh learns that it does not need to obey because commitments are flexible. Over time, even sincere resolutions lose power because the internal system has learned that words do not lead to action. This erosion of trust is subtle but severe. It produces inner instability. You begin to doubt your ability to follow through. Discipline starts to feel unrealistic. Desire appears more honest because it delivers immediate results, even if those results are destructive. The flesh capitalizes on this loss of confidence by positioning itself as the reliable option. Breaking the power of delay requires decisiveness, not intensity. Decisiveness means acting while clarity is present, not waiting for perfect conditions. Perfect conditions never arrive because delay depends on them. Discipline begins with imperfect action taken promptly. This immediacy disrupts the flesh's strategy. Another way delay operates is through distraction. The flesh does not always oppose discipline directly. Sometimes it keeps you busy. Busyness feels productive, but it can be a form of avoidance. When attention is scattered, discipline feels overwhelming. Delay hides behind exhaustion. I'll focus on this when I have more energy. But energy rarely increases without order. Discipline often creates energy, but delay consumes it. The flesh prefers fatigue because fatigue weakens resistance. By filling your time with noise, tasks, and stimulation, the flesh ensures there is no space for reflection or structure. Delay becomes passive rather than explicit. The spirit, however, grows through intentional pauses. Silence, stillness, and reflection compress time. They bring awareness into the present moment. This awareness exposes delay for what it is: fear of change, fear of discomfort, fear of losing familiar coping mechanisms. Most people assume fear is always obvious, but fear often disguises itself as postponement. It says, "I'm not ready," when readiness will never arrive without action. Discipline does not wait for readiness. It creates readiness through repetition. Delay also keeps consequences hidden. When action is postponed, consequences seem theoretical. Discipline, by contrast, forces immediate feedback. You feel discomfort now, so you do not face collapse later. The flesh prefers delayed consequences because they feel unreal. Discipline accepts immediate cost to avoid long-term damage. The most dangerous aspect of delay is that it feels reversible. I can always start later. But time compounds invisibly. Each delay strengthens neural pathways, emotional attachments, and behavioral grooves. Eventually, starting later requires more effort than starting now ever would have. This is why many people wake up years later confused about how they drifted so far from their intentions. They did not rebel dramatically. They delayed quietly. Day by day, the flesh negotiated time until discipline lost its voice. Breaking this cycle does not require drastic measures. It requires removing delay as an option. This means setting non-negotiable actions, not goals. Actions happen now. Goals live in the future. Discipline lives in the present. When the spirit acts immediately, even in small ways, authority is restored. The flesh loses its primary strategy. Delay collapses. Resistance becomes visible. And once resistance is visible, it can be addressed. The battle between discipline and desire is not won by planning alone. It is won by execution without postponement. Each moment of immediate obedience weakens the flesh's confidence. Each refusal to delay strengthens the spirit's leadership. If you recognize delay as a pattern in your own inner life, this awareness is already a breakthrough. But awareness without action becomes another form of postponement. Discipline begins when awareness turns into immediate choice. If you want to continue this journey and understand how to dismantle the deeper strategies the flesh uses to maintain control, subscribe to the channel now. The next topic will reveal how identity, comfort, and self-image bind desire to the self, and how discipline reshapes who you believe you are. Comfort becomes identity. How the flesh bonds desire to who you think you are. One of the most sophisticated strategies of the flesh is not temptation, not urgency, and not even delay, but identity fusion. The flesh does not merely want you to desire certain things. It wants you to believe that those desires define you. Once desire is bonded to identity, discipline no longer feels like growth, it feels like self-betrayal. This is the stage where the inner battle becomes most difficult, because resistance no longer feels external. It feels personal. Comfort is the primary bridge between desire and identity. What begins as a coping mechanism slowly becomes a preference. What becomes a preference gradually becomes just the way I am. Over time, behaviors that once felt optional harden into self-descriptions. This is how I relax. This is how I deal with stress. This is who I am when life is hard. At this point, discipline does not merely threaten pleasure, it threatens self-concept. The flesh understands that people will fight harder to protect identity than to protect habits. You can convince someone to change a behavior. It's far more difficult to convince them to question who they believe they are. This is why the flesh invests so much energy in identity narratives. It attaches emotional meaning to comfort, so that any challenge feels like an attack. This process happens slowly and quietly. The flesh rarely announces, "This desire defines you." Instead, it repeats behaviors until they feel natural. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates attachment. Attachment creates justification. Justification creates identity. By the time discipline enters the picture, the behavior is no longer evaluated on its merits. It is defended as self-expression. This is why people often say things like, "That's just how I am," when confronted with patterns that are clearly destructive. They are not lying. They genuinely feel that these patterns are part of them. The flesh has succeeded in blending desire with self-image. Discipline now feels like denial of the self rather than correction of a habit. Comfort accelerates this fusion because comfort reduces friction. When a behavior reliably produces relief, it becomes emotionally charged. Relief feels like safety. Safety feels essential. Over time, the flesh frames comfort not as a choice, but as a need. Needs feel non-negotiable. Once desire is categorized as a need, discipline appears cruel or unrealistic. This is where many people abandon spiritual discipline altogether. They interpret discomfort as misalignment rather than transformation. They assume that if something feels threatening, it must be wrong. The flesh reinforces this assumption by equating peace with comfort rather than alignment. But peace rooted in comfort is fragile. It collapses the moment comfort is threatened. True peace often begins as discomfort. It requires dismantling false identities built around avoidance, indulgence, and self-protection. The flesh resists this dismantling by invoking narratives of authenticity. Be true to yourself. Don't suppress who you are. Honor your needs. These statements sound noble, but when detached from discipline, they become tools of stagnation. The spirit does not reject the self, it refines it, but refinement feels like loss before it feels like clarity. When discipline challenges comfort-based identity, grief often appears. People mourn the version of themselves that felt safe, even if that safety was limiting. This grief is real, and it must be acknowledged. But it must not be obeyed. The flesh exploits grief by presenting the old identity as irreplaceable. It suggests that without certain comforts, life will become empty, joyless, or unbearable. This fear keeps people tethered to patterns they claim to hate. Discipline threatens the familiar narrative, and the flesh warns of identity collapse. What the flesh hides is that identity built on comfort is brittle. It cannot withstand pressure. When circumstances change, when comfort is removed involuntarily, the self collapses because it has no deeper foundation. Discipline builds identity on values rather than sensations. Values are stable, sensations are not. Another way the flesh binds desire to identity is through comparison. People define themselves relative to others. At least I'm not like them. Everyone has something. This is my weakness. These comparisons normalize patterns and reduce urgency for change. The flesh uses social acceptance as insulation. If a behavior feels common, it feels safe. But common does not mean healthy. Normal does not mean aligned. Discipline often requires standing apart from what is socially reinforced. This separation intensifies identity anxiety. The flesh asks, "Who will you be if you let this go?" Discipline answers, "Someone more aligned than before." But alignment is abstract until lived. The flesh fears the unknown. Identity fusion also explains why people sabotage progress when discipline begins to work. As new habits form, the old identity feels threatened. The flesh responds by intensifying desire or creating emotional turbulence. This turbulence is meant to pull you back into familiar self-definition. Without awareness, people interpret this as a sign that discipline is unsustainable. In reality, this turbulence is identity recalibration. The self is reorganizing around new values. This process is uncomfortable because identity is not just cognitive, it is embodied. The body remembers old patterns. The nervous system resists change. Discipline must persist long enough for the body to learn a new normal. This is why discipline must be compassionate but firm. Harshness reinforces fear. Indulgence reinforces stagnation. Authority requires steadiness. The spirit does not argue with the flesh about identity. It demonstrates a new identity through consistent action. Over time, behavior rewrites belief. As discipline continues, something unexpected happens. The old identity loses emotional charge. What once felt essential begins to feel optional. The fear of loss diminishes. Space opens for curiosity. The self becomes less defensive. This is the moment when discipline stops feeling like restriction and starts feeling like relief. Relief comes from coherence. When values and actions align, internal conflict decreases. The flesh had promised comfort, but delivered chaos. Discipline delivers coherence, which feels like peace. This peace is quieter than pleasure, but far more durable. The spirit-led identity is not built on denial. It is built on discernment. It does not reject pleasure. It contextualizes it. It does not reject rest. It removes escape. It does not reject desire. It removes dominance. This identity feels less dramatic but more grounded. Comfort-based identity thrives on immediacy. Discipline-based identity thrives on meaning. Meaning sustains when comfort fails. This is why people with disciplined spirits remain stable during loss, transition, or uncertainty. Their identity is not anchored to conditions. Breaking the bond between desire and identity requires patience. You cannot argue yourself out of an identity. You must outgrow it through lived consistency. Each disciplined action sends a signal to the nervous system. This is who we are now. Over time, the system adjusts. The flesh will continue to test this new identity. It will revisit old narratives. It will question your motives. It will romanticize the past. These tests are not failures. They are confirmation that identity is shifting. The old self is being dethroned. The battle you cannot escape reaches its deepest level here. This is not about behavior modification. It is about self-definition. The flesh wants to remain the narrator of your story. Discipline hands the pen to the spirit. When the spirit defines identity, desire loses its grip, not because desire disappears, but because it no longer answers the question, "Who am I?" The answer becomes rooted in purpose, alignment, and obedience rather than sensation. This is the turning point where many retreat. Letting go of comfort-based identity feels like stepping into emptiness. But that emptiness is not absence, it is space. Space for a truer self to emerge. If you feel resistance here, If you feel fear at the thought of releasing familiar comforts, that fear is not a sign to stop. It is a sign that identity is being challenged. Discipline must continue gently but firmly. If this message is helping you recognize how desire has shaped your self-image and why discipline feels so personal, subscribe to the channel now. The final topic will reveal how long-term victory is sustained, why relapse is not failure, and how the Spirit establishes lasting dominion without constant struggle. Dominion is built, not claimed. How the Spirit sustains victory without constant struggle. The final deception many people fall into is believing that victory in the inner battle is something that can be claimed once and then permanently possessed. They imagine a moment where discipline finally wins, desire finally disappears, and the conflict ends. This expectation creates frustration and discouragement because real dominion does not arrive as a dramatic conclusion. It arrives as a quiet reordering of authority that must be maintained, not announced. The battle between spirit discipline and flesh desire does not end because desire vanishes. It ends because desire loses its power to govern. Dominion is not the absence of impulses, it is the presence of leadership. The Spirit does not win by silencing the flesh forever, but by establishing a system where the flesh no longer decides direction. Many people misunderstand dominion because they confuse it with intensity. They assume that spiritual strength looks like constant vigilance, relentless resistance, and unending effort. But true dominion feels different. It feels calmer, quieter, less dramatic. When authority is established, fewer battles are required because fewer negotiations occur. Dominion is the result of accumulated discipline. It is not something you declare. It is something you demonstrate over time. The flesh tests authority the same way any subordinate tests leadership, by probing for inconsistency. When discipline is sporadic, the flesh continues to challenge. When discipline is consistent, challenges decrease. Not because the flesh agrees, but because it recognizes futility. This is why long-term victory feels anticlimactic. There is no final confrontation where desire surrenders permanently. Instead, there is a gradual reduction in urgency, intensity, and frequency. Temptations lose emotional weight, impulses arise without panic, choices become simpler, the war becomes less visible because leadership has been established. Sustaining dominion requires abandoning the fantasy of arrival. There is no finish line where discipline becomes unnecessary. Discipline evolves, but it does not disappear. What changes is effort. Early discipline feels heavy because authority is weak. Later discipline feels light because authority is internalized. One of the greatest threats to sustained dominion is complacency. When resistance decreases, people often assume discipline is no longer required. This assumption quietly hands authority back to the flesh. The flesh does not need overt rebellion to regain control. It only needs relaxation of structure. This does not mean living in fear of relapse. Fear itself is a tool of the flesh. It creates tension and reaction. Dominion is maintained through awareness, not anxiety. Awareness notices small shifts early before patterns re-entrench. Anxiety waits for collapse and then panics. Relapse is often misunderstood as failure. In reality, relapse is feedback. It reveals where authority weakened, where structure loosened, or where identity drifted. The flesh uses relapse to shame the spirit into giving up. The spirit must use relapse to recalibrate discipline. Shame is one of the flesh's most effective weapons. It convinces people that a single failure invalidates all progress. This belief is false. Authority is not erased by missteps. It is weakened only when missteps become justification for abandonment. Discipline does not require perfection, it requires persistence. True dominion includes the ability to recover quickly. Recovery is a sign of authority. Collapse without recovery is a sign of fragility. The disciplined spirit does not spiral after failure. It responds. It returns to structure without drama. This response trains the flesh to understand that mistakes do not equal surrender. Another key aspect of sustaining dominion is rhythm. Discipline cannot remain rigid forever. Rigid systems break under long-term pressure. Sustainable discipline adapts without losing authority. It understands seasons, energy levels, and capacity. Adaptation is not compromise when leadership remains intact. The flesh often attempts to disguise abandonment as adaptation. I need flexibility becomes, I no longer need structure. The difference lies in intentionality. Adaptation is deliberate and measured. Abandonment is impulsive and emotional. The spirit must remain the decision-maker even when systems change. Dominion is also sustained through alignment of environment. The flesh thrives in environments that constantly stimulate desire. Discipline is weakened when surroundings contradict values. This does not require isolation, but it does require intentional boundaries. What you consume, where you spend time, and who influences you all affect authority. A disciplined spirit does not rely on willpower alone. It builds surroundings that reduce unnecessary resistance. This is not avoidance, it is wisdom. Leaders do not place themselves in constant chaos to prove strength. They structure environments to support order. Another overlooked aspect of dominion is humility. The disciplined spirit does not boast in control. Pride creates blind spots. When people believe they have conquered desire, they stop paying attention. Attention is essential because the flesh adapts. Dominion requires ongoing discernment. Humility keeps the spirit alert without making it anxious. It acknowledges vulnerability without surrendering authority. It understands that discipline is a practice, not a trophy. This mindset prevents both despair and arrogance. Over time, sustained dominion reshapes perception. Situations that once triggered intense desire barely register. Emotional volatility decreases. Decision-making becomes clearer. The spirit does not need to argue loudly because authority is assumed internally. This is where peace emerges, not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of coherence. The inner system is no longer divided. The flesh still exists, but it no longer disrupts direction. Life feels simpler because fewer internal battles are fought. This simplicity can feel strange at first. Many people are accustomed to inner chaos. Calm feels unfamiliar. The flesh may attempt to reintroduce drama to regain relevance. Discipline must recognize this and refuse to engage. Dominion also changes how you relate to others. When the flesh ruled, reactions were immediate and emotional. Under spiritual authority, responses are measured. Triggers lose power. External chaos no longer dictates internal state. This stability reinforces identity and further weakens desire's influence. Importantly, dominion is not domination. The spirit does not abuse the flesh. It cares for the body, honors rest, and allows pleasure within order. Balance is restored not by indulgence but by leadership. The flesh becomes a servant rather than a tyrant. This is the ultimate goal of discipline, integration. The spirit leads, the mind discerns, and the body cooperates. Conflict decreases because roles are clear. Desire exists, but it is contextualized. Discipline exists, but it is no longer exhausting. The battle you cannot escape does not end in annihilation. It ends in governance. The spirit becomes the governing authority of your inner life. This governance is quiet, stable, and resilient. If you have followed this journey from understanding resistance, building authority, confronting delay, dismantling comfort-based identity, and now sustaining dominion, recognize that this clarity itself is part of transformation. Awareness changes behavior. Structure sustains it. The flesh will continue to test boundaries, but it will no longer define direction unless invited. Dominion does not mean you will never feel tension again. It means tension no longer controls you. This is not a destination reached once. It is a way of living maintained daily. Discipline becomes less about fighting and more about stewardship. You are no longer at war with yourself. You are leading yourself. If this series has helped you see the inner battle with greater clarity and depth, and if you want to continue strengthening spiritual discipline and lasting authority in your life, subscribe to the channel now. Stay connected, because this journey of alignment, leadership, and inner freedom continues beyond this message.